The most expensive thing an HOA ever refused to pay wasn't my $22,000 bill. It was the truth. At exactly 2:13 a.m., a high-pitched mechanical whine sliced through the quiet outside my bedroom window. It wasn't thunder, and it wasn't a truck. It was the steady hum of an industrial pump, the kind of sound that doesn't belong anywhere near a peaceful private lake in the middle of the night. I swung my legs onto the old pine floor, and before my boots even touched the wood, I caught the smell drifting through the cracked window. Wet mud, diesel exhaust, fresh-cut grass. Something was wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch, the cool Texas air carrying the echo of engines somewhere beyond the trees. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I followed the narrow trail my father had walked thousands of times before me. The beam from my flashlight bounced across familiar fence posts until it landed on something that made my stomach tighten. Bright work lights glowed across the shoreline. Two portable pumps sat beside my lake with thick hoses disappearing into the water. Three contractors in reflective vests moved back and forth while water rushed through the pipes with a deep, hollow roar. Standing in the middle of it all was Marjorie Bell Whitcomb. Even at 2 in the morning, she somehow looked like she was attending a luxury brunch instead of trespassing on someone else's property. Her oversized pink designer jacket shimmered beneath the floodlights. Gold bracelets clinked every time she pointed another direction. Her expensive perfume somehow floated above the smell of diesel fuel, and she wore the same smug smile I'd seen every month at HOA meetings. She spotted me before I could say a word. "Perfect timing," she called, as casually as if she owned the place. "The neighborhood gala is this weekend. We're lowering the water a little so the shoreline looks cleaner for photos." I stared at her for several seconds, convinced I had misunderstood what I'd just heard. "You're pumping water out of my lake," I finally said. She laughed softly and adjusted her oversized sunglasses, even though it was the middle of the night. "Our lake," she corrected. "The residents expect premium lakefront views." Those two words stayed with me. Our lake. Not because they made me angry, because they told me exactly how deep this problem had become. Behind her, thousands of gallons of water continued flowing through the hoses. Every minute the shoreline sank another fraction of an inch. The old cedar dock my grandfather built creaked as its supports shifted against the muddy bank. I could smell exposed lakebed for the first time since I was a kid helping my dad repair drainage channels after heavy spring storms. One contractor looked uncomfortable. Another avoided eye contact altogether. They were just doing the job someone had hired them to do. Marjorie stepped closer, holding a clipboard covered with HOA paperwork. "We already approved this improvement project," she said. "Community enhancement falls under the board's authority." I looked at the logo across the top of the papers. Willowmere Estates Homeowners Association. Fancy letterhead. Gold border. Plenty of confidence. Absolutely no permission from me. "Did anyone ask the owner?" I asked quietly. Her smile froze for less than a second before returning, even wider than before. "Ownership can be flexible," she replied. "Community interests come first." I said nothing else. My father used to tell me that the loudest person usually had the weakest paperwork. So I simply watched. I watched the pumps. I watched the hoses. I watched where every tire sat on the ground. I watched one worker photograph the shoreline before another marked measurements on a survey flag. Every little detail settled into my memory like pieces of a puzzle. By sunrise, the pumps were gone. The shoreline looked scarred. Fresh tire tracks crossed my grass. The wooden dock leaned just enough that I noticed it immediately. A section of retaining stones had slipped into the water, leaving muddy streaks running down the bank. Dead fish floated near the reeds, and the morning smelled less like clean lake water and more like churned clay and engine oil. I spent the next 6 hours documenting everything. Every footprint, every damaged board, every collapsed stone. I photographed water levels against the measuring post my grandfather installed in 1989. I hired a licensed marine contractor before lunch. 2 days later, his report landed on my kitchen table with a repair estimate totaling exactly $22,000. I didn't round it up. I didn't round it down. I copied every invoice, attached every photograph, placed everything inside a clean white envelope, and addressed it directly to the Willowmere Estates HOA board. Attention, President Marjorie Bell Whitcomb. I even included a polite cover letter requesting payment within 30 days. No threats. No insults. Just facts. 3 days later, another envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was my invoice, folded neatly in half. Across the front, written in thick red marker, were 6 words that would change everything. Not our lake. Not our problem. I held that envelope in my hands longer than I should have. The paper smelled faintly of printer ink and cheap cologne, and the red marker had bled slightly through the back, where someone had pressed down hard while writing those 6 words. They had not simply rejected my invoice. They had dismissed the idea that I had any claim worth respecting. I folded the paper once, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it inside the same file where I kept every survey, every receipt, every photograph, and every maintenance record my family had collected over 4 decades. My father always believed paperwork deserved the same respect as a good set of tools. You cleaned them, organized them, and never threw away something you might need later. That habit was about to become my greatest advantage. The lake was never just a scenic feature behind my house. My grandfather dug the first drainage channel with a borrowed bulldozer in the late 1970s after 3 straight years of unpredictable flooding. My father expanded it by hand, laying limestone along the shoreline every summer until the banks stayed solid through spring storms. I grew up measuring rainfall instead of baseball statistics. While other kids learned to identify cartoon characters, I learned how to read water levels from a cedar post near the dock. Every scratch on that post marked another season our family protected this property. The smell of wet cedar still reminds me of mornings when my father handed me a shovel before sunrise and said that land always rewarded the people willing to take care of it. After he passed away, I stayed. Most people thought I was crazy for keeping 80 acres instead of selling to developers. They saw dollar signs. I saw memories that could not be replaced. I repaired docks, cleared fallen branches, inspected drainage pipes, and paid every tax bill before it was due. When Willowmere Estates expanded toward my eastern fence line 8 years earlier, I welcomed every new neighbor. Some even thanked me because the lake made their evening walks more beautiful. I never charged anyone to admire the view. I only expected them to respect the property they did not own. That changed the year Marjorie Bell Whitcomb became HOA president. She arrived with expensive handbags, bright designer outfits, and enough confidence to convince people she had all the answers. She talked about raising property values at every meeting. She spoke about community branding, luxury amenities, and creating a premium lifestyle. Somewhere along the way, the lake quietly stopped being my family's private property in her speeches and became the neighborhood's signature attraction. Brochures started calling Willowmere Estates a lake community. Real estate listings advertised exclusive waterfront living. Promotional photographs featured my dock glowing beneath orange sunsets without anyone ever asking permission. I noticed it, but I assumed someone would eventually correct the mistake. Instead, the mistake became accepted as fact. The afternoon after receiving my rejected invoice, I drove past the neighborhood entrance. A massive stone monument welcomed visitors beneath neatly trimmed flower beds. Hanging beside it was a glossy banner showing families sitting beside the water with bold lettering across the bottom. Experience life around Willowmere Lake. I recognized the photograph immediately because the old cedar tree in the corner had been planted by my grandfather in 1983. They had turned my family's history into a marketing campaign. I parked across the road and simply watched people arrive. Real estate agents pointed toward the water while speaking to prospective buyers. Golf carts rolled past carrying residents who waved toward the shoreline as if it belonged to everyone equally. Nobody looked malicious. Most honestly believed what they had been told. That realization bothered me more than the red writing on my invoice. False stories become surprisingly powerful when repeated often enough. I drove home before sunset. The breeze carried the familiar scent of fresh water across the porch, but the shoreline looked different now that the water had dropped. Mud stretched farther than it ever should have. The dock leaned another inch according to the level gauge I checked every evening. I wrote the measurement into my maintenance notebook exactly the way my father had taught me decades earlier. Then I unlocked the old filing cabinet in my workshop. Inside sat dozens of weathered binders labeled by year. Maintenance logs, survey maps, tax receipts, environmental inspections, permit applications. Beneath the bottom drawer rested a faded steel box my father rarely opened. Dust coated the lid, and the brass latch squeaked softly as I lifted it. Inside were rolled blueprints tied with brittle cotton string, handwritten notebooks, and a thick manila envelope with my father's careful handwriting across the front. It read simply, "Water never forgets." At that moment, I had no idea that the papers inside that forgotten envelope would explain why Marjorie had spent years pretending the lake belonged to the neighborhood, instead of asking the one question that could have saved her entire board from making the biggest legal mistake of their lives. The old manila envelope felt heavier than paper should. When I untied the faded cotton string, the smell of aged parchment, cedar dust, and machine oil drifted out like the workshop itself had been waiting years for someone to open it again. My father had labeled every document with the same careful block letters I remembered from my childhood. Survey revision, spillway maintenance, shoreline easement, water control notes. There was nothing dramatic about any of it at first glance. Just decades of careful record-keeping by a man who believed details mattered long before anyone else noticed them. I spread everything across the workbench beneath the yellow shop light. Outside, frogs had already started their evening chorus while the breeze pushed ripples across the lowered lake. One notebook caught my attention immediately because a sentence had been underlined twice. Never argue about water without reading every recorded easement first. I smiled despite everything. That sounded exactly like my father. Calm, practical, patient. He never raised his voice unless someone ignored facts. I spent the next 3 hours reading page after page. My grandfather had documented every improvement made to the property since the original excavation. Every drainage pipe had a date. Every retaining wall had measurements. Every contractor invoice had signatures. Then I reached a folded county survey larger than the others. The edges had yellowed with age, but the ink remained perfectly clear. A blue line traced the shoreline, while another red line outlined the neighboring subdivision exactly where Willowmere Estates stood today. Someone had circled a narrow strip of land connecting the lake to an underground control structure almost 300 yards away. My father had written one sentence beside it in blue ink. "Never sell this corridor. It controls everything." I leaned back in my chair. I knew the corridor existed because I had walked over it hundreds of times while mowing grass, but I had never considered why my father protected it so carefully. The following morning, I drove to the county records office with copies of the old survey tucked inside a weatherproof folder. The building smelled like polished floors, old books, and fresh coffee. A clerk named Denise recognized my family name almost immediately. She disappeared into the archive room and returned with several oversized record books and digital property maps. We spent nearly an hour comparing old surveys with current parcel records. Nothing appeared unusual until she zoomed into one particular easement recorded decades earlier. She frowned slightly before turning the monitor toward me. The subdivision owned walking trails around portions of the shoreline. Utility companies held limited access for underground lines, but the control corridor remained exactly where my father had marked it. Ownership had never changed. Neither had the recorded maintenance rights connected to it. Denise looked at me over her glasses. "Most people never notice these old filings," she said quietly. "Developers usually focus on surface property. Water infrastructure is a different story." I thanked her and drove home with copies of every relevant document. My pulse stayed remarkably calm. I was not excited yet because paperwork only matters if it connects to reality. So instead of calling a lawyer or confronting the HOA, I walked the property myself. The afternoon sun reflected off the lowered water while dragonflies skimmed across the exposed shoreline. I followed the faded survey markers until I reached a patch of overgrown brush almost nobody ever visited. Beneath thick vines sat a rusted steel access cover nearly hidden beneath years of leaves. I brushed away dirt until weathered lettering appeared across the top. Whitaker Water Control. My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. My father had shown me this place once when I was about 12 years old, but I had forgotten almost everything except him saying that nobody should touch it unless absolutely necessary. I knelt beside the cover and carefully cleared away more debris. The locking mechanism remained intact. The inspection seal carried the same permit number I had seen inside the old records only hours earlier. Nothing had been abandoned. Nothing had expired. Everything had simply been ignored because it stayed out of sight. As I stood there listening to the quiet hum of insects and distant birds, another sound drifted across the trees. Laughter, music, golf carts. Curious, I followed the trail back toward the subdivision entrance. A crowd had gathered beside the clubhouse where colorful banners advertised the upcoming lakefront gala. Children pointed toward the water while real estate agents greeted visitors with polished smiles. Then Marjorie stepped onto a small stage wearing another bright designer outfit that practically glowed beneath the afternoon sun. She raised a microphone and proudly announced that Willowmere Estates had invested years creating the area's premier private lake experience. The crowd applauded. I looked from her smiling face to the documents resting inside my folder. She believed every word she was saying. That was the dangerous part. Confidence without verification had carried her this far. But hidden beneath 30 years of county records, maintenance logs, and one forgotten steel access cover was a truth that had never changed. And for the first time since receiving that envelope with red marker across my invoice, I realized I no longer needed anyone to believe me. I only needed the records to speak for themselves. The applause echoed across the clubhouse lawn while I stood beneath the shade of an old pecan tree, watching Marjorie smile for photographs beside a giant banner showing my shoreline at sunset. The photographer kept asking everyone to move a little closer to the water, and every flash of the camera felt like another page being added to a file they did not even know they were building for me. She thanked the board for transforming Willowmere Estates into what she proudly called the region's most desirable private lake community. The crowd clapped again. Nobody questioned the statement because it had been repeated for years. Repetition has a strange way of sounding like evidence. I quietly took out my phone and recorded every word. The breeze carried the smell of grilled burgers from the food tents mixed with the familiar scent of fresh water drifting across the shoreline. Children laughed while couples admired the view. None of them looked dishonest. Most were simply enjoying a Saturday afternoon. My frustration was never directed at families spending time outdoors. It was directed at the people who kept selling a story they had never bothered to verify. Before leaving, I walked through the temporary real estate pavilion where several agents greeted potential buyers. A polished display board advertised premium homes with guaranteed access to Willowmere Lake. Another brochure claimed the association maintained the entire waterfront for the benefit of every resident. I accepted a brochure with a smile, folded it neatly, and slipped it into my folder beside the county records. Promotional claims. Another piece of documentation. On my drive home, I passed the section of shoreline where the pumps had lowered the water only days earlier. Fresh cracks had appeared along part of the retaining wall. The exposed mud still carried tire marks from the contractors. Even from inside my truck, I could smell damp clay warming beneath the afternoon sun. I parked near the dock and spent another hour photographing every visible change. The lake level gauge had dropped another inch since my last entry. I carefully wrote the new measurement into my maintenance notebook exactly the way my father had taught me decades ago. Facts first, opinions later. Early Monday morning, I called the marine engineering company that had prepared my repair estimate. Their senior inspector agreed to meet me again after reviewing the latest photographs. He walked the shoreline slowly, stopping several times to examine the shifted stones and the cedar dock supports. He measured elevations with a laser level, checked moisture beneath the retaining wall, and compared everything against the inspection report from the previous month. When he finished, he removed his hard hat and looked directly at me. "This damage is consistent with an abrupt change in water level," he said. "It is preventable when proper authorization and planning are followed." I asked him one question. "Would you be willing to state that in writing?" He nodded without hesitation. By Wednesday afternoon, another signed report rested inside my growing file. That same evening, a certified letter arrived from the HOA. Instead of responding to my invoice, the board invited me to attend their monthly meeting regarding community cooperation. The wording sounded friendly enough, but the final sentence stood out immediately. Attendance requested before further administrative action becomes necessary. I almost laughed. Administrative action. They still believed paperwork only worked when it carried their logo across the top. Thursday evening, I walked into the clubhouse carrying one leather folder. The room smelled of fresh coffee, lemon furniture polish, and expensive perfume. Marjorie sat confidently at the center of the long table, wearing another brightly colored designer outfit that practically reflected the overhead lights. Several board members smiled politely, while residents filled folding chairs along the walls. The moment I entered, conversations became noticeably quieter. Marjorie welcomed me with the same practiced smile she used whenever she believed she already controlled the outcome. She lifted my rejected invoice between two perfectly manicured fingers as though it were little more than junk mail. "Mr. Whitaker," she began warmly, "we appreciate your passion for the neighborhood, but perhaps it is time we clarified exactly who is responsible for that lake." I placed my folder gently on the table without opening it. The leather made a soft sound against the polished wood. I looked around the room at every face before answering. "I completely agree," I said. "It is definitely time we clarified that." The room became so quiet that I could hear the air conditioner humming above the ceiling tiles. Marjorie leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and smiled with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged before. "Excellent," she said. "Then let us settle this once and for all." She nodded toward the large projector screen behind her. One of the board members clicked a remote, and an aerial photograph of the neighborhood filled the wall. The lake sat in the middle, surrounded by neatly drawn property lines, walking paths, and green spaces. Marjorie stepped forward with the ease of a professional presenter. "As everyone can clearly see," she announced, "our community was designed around the lake. We maintain the walking trails, landscape the shoreline, organize recreational events, and promote the waterfront to support neighborhood property values. It is a shared community asset." Several residents nodded. A few quietly applauded. None of them had seen the county records I carried inside my folder. They only knew the version they had heard every year during annual meetings. Marjorie picked up my rejected invoice again and held it high enough for the front row to see. "Mr. Whitaker believes the association owes him $22,000 because of routine maintenance work." A few people exchanged puzzled looks. Others frowned as if they had just learned I was trying to charge them personally. She carefully avoided mentioning the engineering report or the overnight pumping operation. Instead, she smiled warmly and continued, "We simply cannot authorize payment for damage occurring on what has functioned as community property for years." I remained seated. My father had always said that silence forces people to keep talking, and people who keep talking eventually reveal more than they intend. One board member cleared his throat and added that the association had invested thousands of dollars improving the waterfront experience over the years. Another proudly mentioned holiday events, fishing contests, and family picnics. Every statement sounded polished, rehearsed, and completely disconnected from ownership. When they finally finished, Marjorie turned toward me. "Do you have anything you would like to add?" I slowly stood, opened my leather folder, and removed only 3 items. The first was the engineering report describing the shoreline damage caused by the rapid change in water level. The second was the contractor estimate totaling exactly $22,000. The third was one of the glossy real estate brochures I had collected outside the clubhouse. I placed all 3 on the conference table without raising my voice. "This report explains the physical damage," I said. "This estimate explains the cost to repair it. And this brochure explains why we are all sitting here tonight." Marjorie glanced at the brochure and smiled again. "That is simply marketing material." I nodded. "Exactly. It tells buyers they are purchasing homes with exclusive access to a privately maintained lake controlled by the association." She shrugged. "Because that has always been understood." I looked around the room before answering. Being understood and being legally documented are not always the same thing. A few residents shifted in their chairs. One older gentleman quietly asked whether the association actually owned the lake. Before anyone else could respond, Marjorie answered for him. "Of course we do. Otherwise, none of this would exist." It was the first direct ownership claim she had made all evening, and I noticed 2 board members exchange a quick glance. They looked less certain than she did. I calmly slid another document across the polished table. It was not one of the county records. It was simply the certified mailing receipt proving the board had received my invoice before rejecting it in writing. "Then I assume," I said evenly, "the association also accepts responsibility for activities conducted on property it claims to own." Her smile faded almost imperceptibly. She hesitated just long enough for everyone in the room to notice before answering. "Naturally, within reason." I closed my folder and rested both hands on it. "Good," I replied. "That answer is important." Confusion spread quietly through the audience. They expected an argument. Instead, they watched 2 people speaking almost politely while something far more significant settled into place. I had not come to win the meeting. I had come to document exactly what the board believed, exactly what they claimed publicly, and exactly what they were willing to accept responsibility for before the real property records entered the conversation. As the meeting continued, I realized Marjorie still thought she was leading the discussion. She did not yet understand that every confident answer she gave was becoming another piece of evidence supporting a much larger picture that was finally beginning to come together. When the meeting finally ended, nobody raised their voice. Nobody stormed out. The only sound was folding chairs scraping across the polished floor as residents quietly gathered their things. I slipped every document back into my leather folder and walked into the cool evening air. The scent of fresh-cut grass drifted across the parking lot, while sprinklers clicked steadily somewhere beyond the clubhouse. Behind me, I heard Marjorie laughing with two board members, still completely convinced the evening had gone her way. She thought I had shown up with an invoice. She did not realize I had left with something far more valuable. The next morning, I organized everything across my workshop table. My folder now contained the engineering reports, photographs, certified mailing receipts, promotional brochures, meeting notes, and one particularly important audio recording from the previous evening. Every public statement about ownership had been made voluntarily. Nobody had been pressured. Nobody had been interrupted. They had simply repeated what they believed to be true. My father always said that facts become powerful only after they are arranged in the right order. I spent hours building a timeline instead of building an argument. First came the promotional materials claiming exclusive ownership. Then the overnight pumping operation, then the property damage, then the rejected invoice. Finally came the public meeting where the board openly accepted responsibility for property they insisted belonged to the association. Each document supported the next like carefully stacked bricks. Late that afternoon, I drove back to the county records office. Denise smiled when she saw me carrying the same weatherproof folder. We reviewed the original subdivision filings one more time, this time paying close attention to every recorded easement and maintenance agreement connected to the lake. She opened another digital archive that neither of us had examined during my first visit. Several scanned planning documents appeared on the screen, including correspondence between the original developer and county officials decades earlier. One sentence immediately caught my attention. Recreational access granted through recorded easement only. Ownership of water control infrastructure remains with the adjoining parcel identified as Whitaker Farm. Denise quietly leaned closer to the monitor. That language is unusually specific, she said. Access and ownership are being treated as two completely different things. I requested certified copies before leaving the building. Outside, the warm afternoon sun reflected off the courthouse windows while I sat inside my truck reading every page again. The more carefully I read, the clearer the picture became. Residents had lawful access to designated areas through recorded easements. Walking trails could exist. Certain shoreline sections could be maintained. None of that automatically transferred ownership of the lake itself or the water control system my family had maintained for decades. Somewhere over the years, convenience had quietly replaced documentation. That evening I returned to the old steel access cover hidden beneath the trees. The air smelled of damp leaves and fresh water as crickets filled the silence around me. I brushed away a few new leaves that had fallen since my last visit and unlocked the weathered cover using the original key that had rested inside my father's steel box all these years. The mechanism opened with a slow metallic click followed by the faint smell of cool concrete below. I climbed down the short inspection ladder with my flashlight. The chamber was remarkably dry. Old valves, gauges, and control mechanisms sat exactly where generations of maintenance records said they would be. Every major component carried stamped identification numbers matching the permit documents stored inside my folder. Nothing looked abandoned. Everything had been preserved through regular inspections that my family quietly continued long after most people forgot the structure even existed. I photographed every valve, every identification plate, and every inspection tag before climbing back into the fading evening light. As I secured the cover again, I noticed fresh tire tracks crossing the nearby grass. They were newer than mine. Someone else had recently been searching this area. The tracks led toward the subdivision before disappearing onto a paved maintenance path. I followed them only far enough to confirm the direction. Then I stopped. There was no reason to guess who had driven there. Evidence worked best when it answered questions without assumptions. The following morning, another certified envelope arrived from the association. This time, the board was not requesting cooperation. They informed me that landscaping crews would begin additional shoreline improvements the following week as part of the Lakefront Enhancement Initiative. According to the notice, temporary access across adjacent property might be necessary to complete the work efficiently. I read that sentence twice before carefully placing the letter inside my folder. They still believed they could authorize work around the lake because they still believed they controlled it. I looked across the quiet water shimmering beneath the morning sun, then toward the line of trees hiding the forgotten control corridor my father had protected for so many years. For the first time since this entire dispute began, I knew exactly what my next step needed to be, and it would not begin with another argument. It would begin with the county records speaking louder than either of us ever could. The certified copies arrived 2 days later inside a thick county envelope with blue security seals running along every edge. I laid everything across my dining room table beside the older documents my father had preserved for decades. Fresh paper sat beside yellowed surveys. Digital records sat beside handwritten notes. Different generations. Same story. By sunset, I had highlighted every sentence dealing with ownership, easements, maintenance responsibilities, and water control. One pattern kept repeating itself. The neighborhood possessed limited access. My family possessed control. Those were two completely different legal concepts, and somewhere over the years people had started treating them as though they meant the same thing. Early Friday morning, I scheduled a meeting with a local real estate attorney named Rebecca Lawson. She had spent nearly 20 years handling boundary disputes, easement questions, and rural property matters throughout the county. Her office overlooked the courthouse square, and the waiting room smelled faintly of coffee, leather, and old law books. She spent almost an hour reading without saying very much. Occasionally, she underlined a sentence or compared one survey against another. Finally, she closed the last folder and folded her hands together. "You have been focusing on the wrong question," she said. I looked at her, surprised. "How so?" She slid one certified survey toward me and tapped the narrow corridor my father had circled decades earlier. "You have been trying to prove who owns the lake. According to these records, that question was answered years ago. The real issue is whether the association has exceeded the rights granted through its recorded easements." She opened another document and pointed toward the original development agreement. Access is permission. Ownership is title. Maintenance is responsibility. Those words cannot simply be exchanged because someone prints a brochure. I felt something inside me settle for the first time since the pumps had appeared outside my window. This was no longer a disagreement built on opinions. It was becoming a question answered by recorded documents. Rebecca suggested a careful approach. No dramatic confrontation. No emotional letters. No threats. First, verify every current property description. Second, document every public representation made by the association. Third, notify the appropriate county offices if improvements were planned beyond the recorded easement boundaries. Everything stayed calm. Everything stayed factual. That afternoon, I drove past the shoreline once more. Wooden survey stakes had appeared near the walking path with bright orange ribbons fluttering in the breeze. Spray paint-marked sections of grass beside the water. A contractor's pickup sat nearby, while two workers measured distances with long tape reels. I walked over and introduced myself politely. The foreman greeted me with a friendly handshake. He explained that the HOA had hired his company to begin expanding a decorative viewing area before the upcoming community celebration. I asked one simple question. Did they provide a property survey showing where the work is authorized? He looked briefly toward his clipboard before answering honestly. "We received a concept drawing from the board. They said final boundaries were already approved." I thanked him for his time and wished the crew a safe afternoon. None of them had done anything wrong. They were relying on the information provided by their client. Before leaving, I photographed every survey stake, every equipment location, and every painted marker from the public trail without interfering with anyone's work. As the sun dropped lower, the water reflected streaks of orange across the quiet surface. The lake looked peaceful again, almost as if the last few weeks had never happened. Then my phone vibrated. A neighborhood social media page had posted new promotional photographs for the upcoming gala. The first image showed families smiling beside the shoreline. The second showed the clubhouse. The third stopped me cold. It displayed an artist's rendering of an expanded waterfront plaza extending directly across part of the control corridor identified in the county records. The caption beneath it proudly announced Phase 1 of the Willowmere Lake Improvement Project. I enlarged the image until the details became unmistakable. Decorative stone seating, new lighting, fresh landscaping. Everything positioned exactly where the recorded corridor protected the underground infrastructure my family still owned and maintained. I quietly saved the photograph, captured the date and time it had been published, and placed my phone back into my pocket. The evening breeze carried the familiar smell of fresh water through the trees, while somewhere across the lake, children laughed from the neighborhood playground. Marjorie still believed she was improving a community asset. The contractors believed they were following approved plans. The residents believed they were watching another neighborhood project begin. Only a handful of people knew the documents told a completely different story, and by the time those plans reached the county offices, the difference between believing you owned something and actually owning it was about to become impossible for anyone to ignore. Monday morning arrived with a low blanket of gray clouds hanging over the lake, and the air carried that familiar scent of damp cedar and fresh rain that always reminded me of my father checking water levels before breakfast. Instead of walking to the shoreline first, I drove directly to the county administration building with Rebecca Lawson beside me. Neither of us carried anything dramatic. No oversized binders. No speeches. Just carefully organized documents, certified copies, engineering reports, property surveys, photographs, and the original development records arranged in chronological order. Rebecca smiled as we stepped through the courthouse doors. Today is not about proving someone is dishonest, she quietly said. Today is about making sure the public record matches reality. That sentence stayed with me all morning. We met with the county land records supervisor, who patiently reviewed every certified survey against the digital parcel maps. The room remained almost silent except for keyboards clicking and printers humming somewhere down the hallway. Every few minutes, another document appeared on the large monitor. Easement boundaries, parcel descriptions, water control permits, maintenance agreements, original subdivision filings. Nothing was rushed. Nobody argued. Facts have a remarkable ability to slow everything down. After nearly 2 hours, the supervisor leaned back and adjusted his glasses. The recreational easement is clearly recorded, he said. The shoreline access is clearly recorded. The utility corridor is clearly recorded. But ownership of the water control corridor and associated infrastructure has never transferred from the Whitaker parcel. Rebecca simply nodded. That matches our review. The supervisor continued scrolling through archived filings before stopping on another page. If construction extends into this protected corridor without proper authorization, additional review would normally be required before work proceeds. That was all we needed. Nobody accused the association of intentional wrongdoing. Nobody declared anyone guilty of anything. The county simply acknowledged what had always existed in its own records. Before leaving, Rebecca submitted a formal request asking the planning department to verify that any proposed shoreline improvements remained consistent with the recorded easement boundaries already on file. It was not a lawsuit. It was not an injunction. It was simply a request for administrative review supported by certified documentation. Outside, the rain had finally begun falling in soft, steady drops that darkened the courthouse steps. By the time I returned home, the lake had turned into polished gray glass beneath the overcast sky. Around mid-afternoon, my phone rang. The caller identified himself as the project manager for the construction company hired by the HOA. His voice remained professional throughout the conversation. He explained that county staff had contacted his office requesting additional documentation before shoreline work could continue. Until the review was complete, his company would temporarily postpone construction inside the proposed work area. I thanked him for calling and wished his crew the best. They had handled the situation exactly the way responsible professionals should. The following day brought another surprise. A notice appeared on the neighborhood website announcing that the lakefront improvement project had been delayed pending routine administrative clarification. The wording sounded harmless enough, but the comments beneath the announcement told a different story. Residents began asking simple questions. Who actually owned the shoreline? Why was additional documentation suddenly necessary? Why had construction been postponed after promotional materials had already been distributed? Nobody seemed angry. They simply wanted accurate information. Late that afternoon, I drove past the clubhouse. The bright orange survey stakes were still standing, but the heavy equipment had disappeared. Temporary fencing now surrounded the proposed construction area with a small county notice attached near the entrance indicating that additional review was underway. The wind gently rattled the plastic mesh, while fallen leaves collected around the unopened gate. Across the parking lot, I noticed Marjorie speaking with two board members. Even from a distance, I could tell her confident smile had become noticeably tighter than before. She pointed repeatedly toward the shoreline, while one board member studied paperwork and another kept checking a phone. For the first time since all of this began, she was no longer directing events. She was reacting to them. I did not interrupt their conversation. There was nothing left for me to explain. Every important document already rested where it belonged, inside county offices instead of inside my workshop. Every engineering report had been submitted. Every certified survey had been reviewed. Every public statement about ownership remained preserved exactly as it had originally been made. As I walked back toward my truck, the breeze carried the clean smell of rain across the quiet lake. The water level had begun recovering after the earlier pumping, and small ripples spread across the surface beneath a pair of geese gliding toward the reeds. My father used to say that water always finds its proper level if people stop trying to force it somewhere else. Watching the lake settle back into place, I realized the same thing was finally happening with the truth. 3 weeks later, the county completed its review, and the answer arrived without drama, without headlines, and without anyone raising their voice. A formal notice confirmed that the recorded easements granted the neighborhood limited access to specific shoreline areas, but ownership of the water control corridor and the associated infrastructure had never transferred from the Whitaker property. Any future improvements affecting those protected areas would require authorization consistent with the recorded property rights already on file. It was not a miracle. It was not a surprise. It was simply the public record catching up with reality. Within days, the temporary construction fencing disappeared. The decorative plaza plans quietly vanished from the neighborhood website. The colorful promotional artwork showing the expanded waterfront was removed and replaced with a much simpler announcement stating that future projects would remain within approved community property. Even the glossy real estate brochures changed. The words "exclusive private lake" became "scenic lake views." Just 3 small words had disappeared, but those 3 words had carried years of assumptions behind them. A week after the county review, Rebecca called to let me know the association's attorney had reached out requesting a meeting. We met inside a quiet conference room overlooking the courthouse lawn. There were no television cameras, no cheering crowds, and no dramatic speeches. The board acknowledged that mistakes had been made regarding the interpretation of the easement documents and the planning of shoreline improvements. They also agreed to resolve the documented repair costs connected to the sudden water level change rather than continue arguing over evidence that now spoke for itself. The engineering reports, photographs, maintenance records, and certified documents had done exactly what they were supposed to do. They removed emotion from the conversation and replaced it with facts. Several weeks later, the repair funds arrived, and I immediately hired the same local contractors who had maintained the shoreline for years. Fresh limestone reinforced the retaining wall. The cedar dock was carefully leveled again. Native grasses were replanted along the bank to stabilize the soil before the next rainy season. As each repair was completed, the familiar smell of fresh-cut cedar and damp earth slowly replaced the lingering scent of disturbed mud. Watching skilled craftsmen restore something my grandfather had built felt far more satisfying than winning any argument ever could. One quiet Saturday morning, I walked back to the old steel access cover hidden beneath the trees. Sunlight filtered through the branches while birds sang somewhere above the shoreline. I unlocked the weathered cover, completed another routine inspection, checked every gauge, recorded every reading inside the same maintenance notebook my father had started decades ago, and secured everything exactly as he would have done. Nothing about the process felt extraordinary. That was the point. Responsible ownership is usually quiet. It happens long before anyone notices it. Later that afternoon, I saw several families walking the public trail beside the lake. Children pointed toward turtles resting on old logs while parents stopped to admire the water reflecting the blue Texas sky. They smiled, took photographs, and continued their walk. I smiled too. They had never been my problem. They never were. My disagreement had never been about neighbors enjoying the beauty of the lake. It had always been about respecting the difference between access and ownership, between assumptions and records, between confidence and proof. As for Marjorie, I rarely saw her after everything settled. When we occasionally crossed paths, she offered a polite nod, and I returned it. Sometimes the strongest ending is not revenge. Sometimes it is simply a clear boundary that everyone finally understands. Standing on my dock that evening, listening to frogs begin their familiar chorus while gentle waves touched the shoreline my family had protected for generations, I realized my father had been right all along. Water never forgets, and neither do well-kept records. Justice is rarely loud. More often it arrives inside a certified envelope, a carefully maintained file, or a quiet decision grounded in facts instead of pride. That is exactly how this story ended. Now I would love to know what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have handled it the same way, or would you have chosen a different path? Share your thoughts in the comments because I genuinely enjoy reading how different people see situations like this. And if stories about patience, property rights, and smart solutions remind you that honesty and preparation still matter, consider subscribing and joining us for more stories where calm persistence proves stronger than empty authority. Until next time, take care of what is yours, respect what belongs to others, and never underestimate the quiet power of keeping good records.